afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on basic sociology, in today's lecture we're going to discuss on racial and ethnic inequality. This is a kind of a inequality which has been faced by several ethnic group and racial groups across the world. But before we start discussing racial and ethnic inequality, let us try to focus that we are going to refer to one article which is going to discuss on the racial and ethnic perceived discrimination, specifically with reference to US. Now, why do we need to discuss a reading in the Western context? The reasons are two. Number one, that it is very important to understand that inequality is all pervasive. It's found in all kinds of society and not necessarily a phenomena to be found in the Asian country. Number two, to critique the modernization theories that kind of argue that with development, with industrialization, society will become egalitarian. When we look into this discussion with specific reference to American society, we come to a conclusion that inequality has become more pervasive, it's become more complex, mainly in advanced industrial society. So let us now talk about discrimination and ethnic inequality. Discrimination is prevalent in contemporary American society at various levels, at interpersonal and institutional, in multiple domains, workplaces and schools, and across diverse social groups. When we talk about diverse group, it implies race, ethnicity and gender. So when we talk about discrimination at interpersonal level, we know that it is in everyday life between the women and the men. At an institutional level, we see at the level of politics or the structures of the markets which are unequal. At every place we go, whether we talk about the office or we talk about the domestic sphere, discrimination is rampant. And then when we have a mixed group or a heterogeneous group, say the white and the black or the Hispanic, the American, the Latino American, different identity are there, the discrimination becomes more pervasive. Discrimination continues to produce and perpetuate inequalities in education, income, health, politics and other realms of life. Racial and ethnic minorities in the United States constitutes a major target of prejudice and discrimination. Scholarly work has indicated that racial ethnic discrimination may be the most prevalent form of discrimination in America, especially among the minority groups. The minorities are the ones who, by and large, who are kind of the black population or the migrants, the immigrants to the country, and we find it all over in every sphere of life, education, health, politics, every realm of life. There is a kind of pervasive inequality and discrimination. So here the lecture is focused to discuss the paper titled Racial and Ethnic Differences in Perceptions of Everyday Discrimination, and the authors are Fang Gong, Zoon Exu and David Tekuchi. The authors here have studied the prevalence of racial discrimination in the USA. Now, when we talk about the approach that the authors have taken is the whole idea of symbolic interactionism. So, earlier in much of sociological theory, the idea was to discuss the prevalence of discrimination mainly at an institutional level. Say how many members from the minority group were getting education, or at the work structure. This is trying to talk about the everyday reality or the lived experience of race and ethnicity, and that is why the author is focusing on perceived discrimination. So, the authors have examined perceived discrimination as affected by both social structural factors. And what are the social structural factors? These are race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. The second factor that has been examined are the psychosocial factor. That is your identity, how are you interacted in terms of who you are, what you are. So, your identity is a determining factor not only to get access to resources, but also how you will be treated in your everyday life. And this, the authors are arguing that they kind of face racial, ethnic discrimination in every part of their life, every moment of their life. They are discriminated, and as a result the overall psychosocial identity gets affected. So, the authors have examined in this study macro structural factors such as race, ethnicity, and SES stands for socio-economic structures, and immigration related factors are also associated with discrimination. Earlier, in much of the literature on discrimination and racial inequality, a very little attention was paid to microstructural mechanism, such as examining how one's identity may shape perception of discrimination. So, in a way, the micro and the macro are connected to each other. The micro is your everyday life, how you are being treated as a black or as a member of a minority community, and that kind of affects your psychosocial upbringing, your identity, and it is then reflected at a macro structure where we kind of hear that there are very few presidents, say, of the US from the black community, or we say that there is a kind of a less representation of women in politics. So, the micro everyday interaction leads to the larger part which is represented at a microstructure. So, the authors are here not looking at the macrostructural discrimination, but are focusing at the everyday experience of the racial discrimination. And therefore, the most important concept here is perceived discrimination. The focus on perceived chronic or everyday discrimination, which is measured by self-report of being treated with less courtesy, called names, or insulted. So, your entire frame with which you interact with, say, a member of the lower community or a minority is in kind of derogative. You are kind of having already a mental frame where you are degrading, you are calling certain names, slang names, or insulting. So, that is your everyday reality, everyday experience of discrimination. Prior research has suggested that subtle and chronic forms of discrimination are more prevalent in contemporary societies and have more severe consequences than acute discrimination, especially regard to health. So, here is when we talk about the subtle chronic, so because of, say, legal reformation, the media consciousness, we do not find a very discriminatory political or economic structure. So, where has inequality actually got transited? It has got into the everyday interaction, and especially if everyday interaction is demotivating, demoralizing, it has a wider repercussion on the health of the individual. So, perceived discrimination reflects real experiences that are not necessarily real discriminatory incidences, because much of the time this everyday minor interactions are not recorded. They are not kind of part of any government census report or any kind of the data, and therefore they are not kind of counted as discriminatory, but indirectly it is playing an important role in constructing the identity of individual who are subject to discrimination. So, perceived everyday discrimination is highly prevalent among racial ethnic minorities in the United States. African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans report the highest level of discrimination. Most Asian and Latino groups report less discrimination. So, even within the members of different ethnic group, there is a hierarchy in which the discrimination is experienced. So, education, income and immigration related factors are positively associated with perceived discrimination. So, there is a kind of a different layer. You may be from a minority group, but you are highly educated or you have a high income. That will affect the everyday experience of discrimination. So, effects of racial ethnic identity on perceived discrimination vary across ethnic group with stronger association among Afro-Caribbeans. Now, before we go into the details of understanding the findings of the result, it is important to understand the significance of such a work, and this can be understood in terms of some of the important research questions that the authors are raising here. Number one is, how do various racial and ethnic groups differ in the perception of everyday discrimination? Number two, how do individual structural location apart from racial ethnicities such as socioeconomic status and immigration related factors influence the perception of discrimination? Number three, what role does one's racial ethnic identity play in perception of discrimination? And number four, how does racial and ethnic identity interact with race ethnicity in impacting perceived discrimination? So, as we know, there is a kind of a two-way interaction. How you are treated in your everyday life will also kind of lead to the constructions of ideas around discrimination and how you perceive discrimination. So, if you are a minority and plus you are less educated or you will have a less income group, the experience of discrimination is much more, and therefore you will perceive the system as negative, in a negative mode. So, they are like kind of lot of combination and permutation, and there is no one straightforward understanding that this is a community which is discriminated. They are kind of very subtle way in which the discrimination experiences, and that further structures inequality in the American society. Now, let us go back to the study by the three authors. Here this study examines the difference in perceptions of everyday discrimination across racial and ethnic minority. The findings of the study show that perceived everyday discrimination is highly prevalent among racial and ethnic minorities, with African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans reporting the highest experience of discrimination. And there are other, it's not only your racial or ethnic identity that is important to understand the experience of discrimination. Other factors also go along, and these factors are education, income, immigration related factors, and all kind of go together in terms of understanding perceived discrimination. Here the authors are using three sets of variable, and these three sets of they have identified three sets of variable to explain the racial ethnic difference in perceived discrimination. So, the number one is perceptions are simply reflection of reality. So, they are a kind of a perception of discrimination that it is actually a reflection of reality. So, how you are treated is where you are placed in the social structure. So, at the macro structural level, racial ethnic stratification in the United States may affect perceptions of discrimination, so that those at the top of racial hierarchy may experience and perceive less discrimination than those at the bottom. Number two is discrimination in the eye of the beholder and does not reflect reality. So, it depends on your individual experience. So, you individually may have been subject to discrimination, but others in the group have not been. So, it is not the reality of a larger part, but you yourself kind of feel that the society is discriminatory. So, the structural positions such as socioeconomic status, immigration related factors such as duration of residence and language proficiency. So, the longer period you have stayed in the United States and you have been able to master English as a language, your experience of discrimination will reduce, because then you will from an outsider get kind of be assumed to be part of the insider. So, the way in which you are able to process information and interpret the experiences, all of these kind of leads to the way in there is a lot of variation in perceived discrimination. The third set of variable is the perception of discrimination are influenced by group identification. From a micro perspective, one's identification with a race or ethnicity may also be associated with perceived discrimination. So, individually you may not have experienced discrimination, but your group or the group to which you belong have been for a long time been subject to certain discriminatory practices. So, the perception would be in favor of the group, that there is a kind of discrimination faced by the group. So, when we understand these three sets of, we kind of here the authors are trying to focus specifically on understanding racial discrimination. And this we know that discrimination continues to produce and perpetuate inequalities in education, income, health, politics and other realms of life. Racial and ethnic minorities in the United States are major target of prejudice and discrimination. Racial discrimination is the most prevalent form of discrimination, especially among the minority groups. And the study aims to understand how various racial ethnic groups differ in their perception of discrimination. In the United States, race ethnicity stratification has a marked effect on discrimination. Bonilla Silva, published in 2004 and 2010, argues that the racial stratification system in the United States is undergoing a transformation from a biracial. What is biracial? Two groups. And what were the two groups? The white versus the non-white or the black. And the argument by Bonilla Silva is changing from biracial to triracial order. That is, there are three levels of hierarchy where the entire immigrant or the minority community has been divided into three racial groups. He delineates a racial stratification system primarily based on skin tone as well as ethnicity. According to this system, that is the triracial system, at the top are non-Hispanic whites and a few assimilated Asian and Latino group. At the bottom of the hierarchy are collective blacks, comprised of blacks, Afro-Caribbeans, African immigrant and some dark-skinned Asian such as the Vietnamese, Latino, such as Puerto Ricans and Mexican. So, a number of people from different geographical regional areas because of the color of the skin has been classified into a group called the collective black, and the collective black kind of are at the bottom of the racial discrimination. In the middle are honorary whites such as light-skinned Asians, Latinos and most multiracials. Empirical studies have provided some support for the triracial order thesis based on socio-demographic factors such as income, attitudinal factors such as racial attitude and self-classification, social interaction factors such as residential segregation. So, in much of the United States, there is a kind of a segregation in terms of the residents. So, certain areas will have a high population of the white, whereas other regional areas will have very high population of the collective blacks. So, if we go by the triracial stratification thesis, which is saying that there are these three groups, then the experience or the perceived discrimination would be that the white category are more favorable by others and experience the least amount of discrimination. The honorary whites, who are at the middle of the stratification, faces a moderate amount of discrimination, and the collective blacks treated least favorable and greatest exposure to the discrimination. Now, this is the perception if we follow the triracial stratification thesis. However, in everyday experience of discrimination, there is a contrary to this theory, and there does not exist a distinct three-tier hierarchy in the perception of discrimination. So, the experience would be a kind of, maybe it is kind of more among the honorary whites and less among the collective black. Why? Because it is not only your color or the region, a number of other factors are also kind of working together to determine the experience of discrimination. So, in addition to the race and ethnic factor, we know that the most important factor that determines the experience of stratification is the structural position. The structural position, say, at the work. So, if you are kind of a political leader, you might be a black, but your experience of discrimination would be less. So, in the study, the author proposed a differential status thesis. So, one theory is the triracial theory. The second theory about the experience perceived discrimination is the differential status thesis, where the experience of discrimination depends on your occupational position. These theorists argue that there is a kind of a very profound racialized and ethnicized society in the United States. So, the socioeconomic status and immigration related factors can affect one's experience and understanding of social situation that might involve discrimination. Prior scholarship demonstrates that education is positively related to perceived discrimination. There are several possible explanations for these findings. Number one, well-educated individuals usually have enhanced awareness about racial and ethnic discrimination and are thereby more likely to identify and report such discrimination. Second, because of institutional racism and the glass ceiling effect, individuals with a high level of education might not experience same financial and professional advantage as their white counterpart, thus creating a stronger sense of victimization. So, the differential status thesis takes in account the socioeconomic status, education and the number of years of residence in the United in terms of experience of discrimination. So, discrimination is prevalent, it is kind of very subtle and chronic, but there is a lot of variance in the hierarchy. The hierarchy is not fixed and the experience would vary in terms of the position in the hierarchy. For reference, the text is Fangong, Zun Xu and David Takeuchi, 2016, published Racial and Ethnic Difference in Perceptions of Everyday Discrimination, published in the journal Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, page 1 to 16. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.